Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage our first speaker. As we acknowledge today's crazy accelerated speed of change, few people are as well versed on that subject as management consultant, author, innovator, Geoff Tuff. Geoff has spent over 25 years consulting to some of the world's top companies on growth, innovation, and adaptation. Detonate, which you'll all be getting a copy of his book today, Detonate, his new book, is the survival guide for organizations trying to navigate this era of accelerated change and disruption. Please welcome Geoff Tuff.
I'm on top of the world. I'm on top of the world. Waiting on this for a while now. Paying my dues to the dirt. I've been waiting this long.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I know you guys are all super psyched to have the afternoon kicked off by a consultant, but hopefully I will be able to live beyond the reputation of consultants. I'm going to try to engage some of you in a little bit of conversation as we go through this, so please don't be bashful. I know you're all in the middle of eating lunch, but this will go a lot better if you're willing to offer some thoughts as we go through this. So as mentioned, I recently wrote a book called Detonate, which is going to be the focus of what I talk about today, but really most of the observations that I have to share, most of the observations in the book come from wandering around large, usually really successful organizations for the past 20 or 30 years and seeing the stuff that's getting in the way. So I'm going to start perhaps in a non-intuitive place. How many athletes do we have in the room? What do you all do? What if we set the bar really low? How many people in the room move a little bit faster than a walk on occasion? Okay, that is a little bit better. What are some of the sports that you're all athletes in? Just shout them out. What are your favorite sports? Cycling, that's a very popular one these days. Soccer, skiing, golf. Did someone say improv? That's a great sport. How many of you do this? How many high jumpers do we have in the crowd? Shockingly, there seems to be none. Where? Oh, well maybe you can come up and help me do this part of the presentation. Is it? I'm actually just kidding. But is this how you high jump? 7 feet. No, but is this how you do it? No. No, probably not. This is actually the way that high jumping was done for many, many years. The idea behind high jumping and the way that most athletes, most high jumpers, track and field athletes, approached it was to back up some amount of yardage, 50, 60 yards, run as fast as they could, hurl themselves in the air first feet, and try to go as high as they possibly could. And that's just the way it was done. And they tried to get the bar higher and higher and higher. Over time, they did make some improvements, but that's what it looked like until this guy came along. And that's actually not part of my presentation, that clang as Dick Frostbury comes up. I don't think that's a picture of Dick. But this is what he had to say at the Mexico City 1968 Olympic Games. He said, "I was told over and over again that I would never be successful, that I was not going to be competitive, and the technique was simply not going to work. All I could do was shrug and say, we'll just have to see." That's really the mindset that we're trying to encourage all scaled, successful organizations to adopt today for a whole variety of reasons that I'm going to go through. And Dick Frostbury, one man, came along and changed the entire sport of high jumping. I assume, sir, that this is what you look like when you high jump? That artful, correct? Yes, of course. So let's get into it a little bit. I have been spending the better part of the last 15 years or so consulting specifically on the topic of innovation and growth strategy. And I will say it's a pretty good gig. So there's not many senior executives in the world today where if you come and say, hey, I'd like to share some thoughts about what innovation is, how to do it successfully, how to make more money from innovation, who will throw you out of the office. Most of the time they say, yeah, please come and share some thoughts. And most of the time we have a great conversation. And at the end of it, we shake hands or say goodbye. They say, we absolutely need to do something about this. I follow up with them a little bit later and they say, yeah, it's something we got to do. But I got to close the quarter. So why don't you come back in a month or 2 or 3 and we can have a conversation again, and guess what happens 3 months later? This is the response part of the talk. What happens 3 months after you have to close a quarter? You have to close another quarter, and it just goes on and on and on. And there's always good reasons to innovate. I have a very basic definition of innovation, which is it is the creation of new economic value. There's always been good reasons to innovate, why innovation has been important. You may have different leadership come in who declares that innovation has to be the lifeblood of the company, or you face competitive pressures, or you face some sort of regulatory change. There's always been good reasons to innovate. But now, innovation is urgent. And it's literally happened in the past 2 or 3 years. I can tell you, just having those same conversations with executives, it's just been in the past 2 or 3 years that it's felt to be urgent. And the whole reason is the pace of technological change. I know that's not a blinding insight to any of you. But the interesting thing that we're starting to see is that partly on account of many technologies sitting on top of computing power, and we all know Moore's law that it is on an exponential curve, the power of computing is on an exponential curve. We're seeing the impact of exponentials across all sorts of different domains. Artificial intelligence, AR, VR, nanotechnology, you name it, there are any number of trends and technologies that exist out there today that themselves are on an exponential curve. And what we're living through right now, what we started to see evidence of starting a couple years ago, is the crossing of an exponential curve with what would have been a linear curve. And we as humans can't deal with it. We just we can't conceive of what exponential change looks like. So as an example of that, let me, again, ask for some participation. If I walk 30 linear steps from here, where am I going to end up, roughly, besides on my face on the floor over there? But roughly, where would I be? I can't see any of you, so I'm assuming you're going to say that I'm somewhere over here, right? We can all kind of conceive of 30 linear steps, 30 yards. It's about 3 first downs, whatever mechanism you want to use to imagine 30 steps. It's not that hard. What would 30 exponential steps look like? So if I took my first step is 1, my next step is 2, my next step is 4, there's a doubling effect, 30 of those, where would I be if I started here? The moon? Did someone say Harvard? Oh, say it one more time. Hartford, Connecticut. Anyone else? Come on, just guess. California, okay. The answer is 26 times around the Earth. And the reason none of you got that right, although the moon was pretty close, is that we've never lived with exponentials before. We've never had to try to identify what change looks like when it's on an exponential curve. And when we've been looking at technologies or exponentials from the past, because we are wired to be linear, we've lived in organizations that have faced linear change all our lives, we've thought that change in the future will go something like this, or maybe something like that. But an exponential curve, what happens is, and I really should have a slide for this rather than trying to do it with my arms, but an exponential curve, if it started in the same place, I should probably do it this way for you. If it started in the same place, it would start off pretty slow, and then it would cross the linear curve and shoot up. And we're right at that point where it's crossing right now. What we've been living through since the development of many of these exponential trends, think about Google Glass when it was first released. Google Glass existed for a long time in this trough of disillusionment where the exponential curve hasn't crossed the linear curve, and you got things happening like people wearing them being called glass holes, no one taking them seriously. What's happened in the past year, though, is the Chinese government has adopted it's not actually Google Glass, but it's very, very similar, for deployment across their entire police force to do facial recognition. That's the impact of something that sits on an exponential curve, and it's the primary reason why we are in such danger right now of becoming irrelevant in the work we do and the companies that we exist in if we don't pick up our heads and pay attention to the things that need to change. Many of you have probably seen some version of this chart before. The basic story is you're probably going to go out of business. If you're a scaled, successful company, if you're on the S&P 500, your likelihood of staying on the S&P 500 is way, way lower, and your lifetime on that list is way, way lower than it ever has been in the past. So back in the 60s, the average lifespan was something like 50 or 60 years. Now it's under 15 years and dropping. And that's not just because people are being disrupted by startups. It's not just because there are better solutions out there than the companies that exist today. It's because the people who live in these successful companies, who have a scaled, successful business model, don't pay attention to the fact that they need to change. They presume that the things that have worked in the past are the things that will govern the way that the future will unfold, and they basically stick to the playbooks that they've been taught. I'm going to start with now this is admittedly a kind of consultancy place to start, and I apologize for that, but I want to give you a frame for how I think about the world of innovation and why it's so important that we start paying attention to the changes happening around us. This is an article that I wrote over 6 years ago at this point. HBR was nice enough to give us the cover of their magazine for a very simple observation, and the simple observation was that, and the hypothesis we had at the time, was that when you look at serial innovators, people who are great at launching innovations in the world time and time again, everyone knew that they got paid a capital markets premium. But the hypothesis we had is that even amidst that set, the great innovators of the world, the ones that out-earned their peers in the capital markets, the one who were paid the most by the shareholders, were those that were able to maintain at any given point in time a portfolio of innovations relevant for their strategic position. That's the most consultancy thing I'm going to say this whole half hour, I promise you. And what we set out to do is to understand what is a good portfolio structure. What should companies be aiming for when it comes time to innovate? So I'm not going to go into detail of the chart you see up there. The article is publicly available, but basically what we do is we framed the challenge of innovation as existing in 3 different levels of ambition. You can innovate in your core business, meaning optimizing existing sets of products for existing customers, sometimes edging into new product categories or new customer groups, marketing better, and driving growth in your core business. That's one level of ambition for innovation. On the other end of the spectrum, you can drive transformational innovation, which is the way we defined it. If you dig into the details of what this chart is, the way we defined it is that is deploying new capital to discover needs in the world that people have never expressed before. They've never been able to tell you that this is what they're looking for. This is what Steve Jobs claims, and I think arguably was right in claiming that Apple was so good at, anticipating what customers are going to need before they can ever tell you about it themselves. Then there's this vast space in the middle, innovating in the adjacent space, which is about stretching into further and further afield business opportunities. And there is a key difference between adjacent innovation and transformational innovation in that, based on the way I define transformational, that is about ignoring the asset base you have today to go and operate differently, whereas an adjacent play is something where you're stretching from an existing asset or capability or position or what have you in the market. So the punchline to all of this is we did the research, we found out, shockingly, we were right in our hypothesis. They probably wouldn't have given us the space for the article if we were wrong. And what we discovered is there is an optimal portfolio structure for any company, but there is an average that you can kind of keep in mind. And the average right spend, if you want to out-earn your peers in the capital markets, is you should be spending 70% of your time and effort in the core, 20% in the adjacent space, and 10% in the transformational space. This is what we discovered six plus years ago. And weirdly, I have no idea why, weirdly, the return from that system was virtually the inverse, where 70% of what you were earning from your innovation efforts came from those big bold bets in the transformational space, 20% from the adjacent space, and 10% from the core, which probably makes sense because it's somewhat aligned with risk. I've learned 2 things in the ensuing 6+ years that I've been out talking to executives about this. First of all, no one has any clue where their innovation spend is or has been. No one. I don't care how well financially managed you are, no one has any clue where their innovation spend is going. And the second is everyone way overestimates the degree to which they're operating outside the core. So on the few occasions when companies actually do invite us in and they feel that innovation is urgent and they ask us to look at their innovation portfolios and actually come up with an estimation of how much they're spending across core, adjacent, and transformational, what we discover is most of the time, 95 or 96 or 97% of what they're doing is focused on their core business. And I'm guessing for many of the people in the room today who are in media and marketing services, that's where the vast majority of the spend is coming from, to optimize the core, sometimes to stretch into adjacencies. It's a great gig, when times are changing slowly. But the challenge we've got is that everything's changed in those 6 years. That research I did back then is wrong now. I can virtually guarantee you. I haven't done it again, but if we did do it again, the numbers would not be 70-20-10. They'd be something like 50-30-20, or maybe even more aggressively focused on the adjacent and transformational space because of the speed of change that we see in any of the markets around us, in what consumers are looking for, in the opportunities we have to operate differently. It is a fundamental truth that we have to be more aggressive in working in the adjacent and transformational space. And so the simpler version of that chart that I've been using recently, and actually that a lot of this book, Detonate, is founded upon, is this one up here. So it's still the same ambition matrix behind that thing. You can probably still see the arcs on it. You've still got the core, adjacent, and transformational. But all we did is we drew a line from the top left to the bottom right and said, basically, there's two different types of opportunity that exist in the world. Everything below the line in the core and near adjacent space is the known or knowable opportunity set, meaning there are markets that you play in today, or there are markets that exist that your competitors may play in, and you can go into the market and get good data by asking people what they're looking for. You can do large-scale quant studies, you can do focus groups, and you're going to get pretty good information back. Above the line is, by definition, unknown, and in some cases unknowable. In that transformational space, you can't go and ask consumers or customers what they're looking for if it's in the transformational space. You're just going to get bad data back. And so my hypothesis now, if we were to do this research again, is that what we've seen over the course of the last 3 years is a massive migration of opportunity from below the line to above the line. And every single scaled organization that is making money effectively today is optimized to serve only below the line. If you're in market research in most scaled successful companies, you're doing quant studies for any opportunity that comes along to you. If you're doing product development, you're running opportunities through a stage gate system to assess risk and make financial decisions about what to move through the pipeline for every opportunity that comes along. And unfortunately, what we've discovered and what we've seen time and time again is if you run your company assuming that the opportunities that exist out there are known or knowable, but they're actually unknown and in some cases unknowable, not only are you going to get it wrong, you're probably going to end up destroying value as well. If you put a great opportunity through a stage gate system that's in the unknown space, and you force your product teams to go out and collect data that's actually bullshit, and you're putting that into your financial model as a way to get through the gate review, where the objective function becomes getting through the gate as opposed to coming up with a great idea, you're going to end up doing damage. Either you're going to force the people working on that project to make the opportunity more and more knowable so that the data that's in the financial model to pass the gate review is good data, or they're going to make stuff up. And they're going to say, well, it's a hypothesis, we'll come back and test it later, but they really never go and test it, and they end up creating some sort of mechanism to get through the gate reviews that's based on a fallacy. So the reason this all comes about is ultimately, we think, Steve Goldbach is my co-author, based on just normal human nature, individuals, all of us. And this is a caricature, obviously, but there used to be a virtuous cycle for how to succeed in big-scaled companies. And we say it starts with planning for a long career. I don't care if your definition of long is 2 years or 5 years or 30 years, but basically, most of the time when people join big-scaled successful companies, they said, I want to stick around here for a while. And so when they came on board, they listened to what their onboarders would tell them, they listened to what the trainers would tell them, and they embraced some of the orthodoxy, the conventional wisdom of how the company operates or how the market operates, and they followed the playbooks. Sometimes these were literally training manuals and playbooks about what to do when you're faced with a certain decision, how you allocate your marketing spend in certain types of situations, when you need to do product reviews, when you need to check the price on your products that are in the market. Those are all things that, whether they're written down or not, govern the way that most successful companies operate. And when it came time to make a bet on a marginal call where there wasn't a clear guidance from the playbook, most of the time, if we want to enjoy a long career, we make the safe bet. We say, I don't know exactly, it's not written down, but I'm probably going to do something that, if I do get it wrong, is not going to get me fired. Either I make the right decision and it ends up going well, luckily, or I make the wrong decision, but because I adhered to the playbooks as closely as possible, the people who taught me those playbooks, my mentors, my leaders of the company, can't fault me, and so we'll just brush that aside. And it just led to this virtuous cycle. If you followed the playbooks, things generally went well. What we're seeing now is that that system has broken down. And when you make a safe bet on a marginal call, things sometimes don't just go a little bit wrong. They can go dramatically wrong. You can get blindsided by a competitor that you never even knew existed out there. You can get all the data in the world about a new product launch being successful because that's what customers have been telling you, and you take it out into the world and it completely flops. So no longer can you rely on making the safe bets. And the weird thing is, when we get the bets wrong, when we make the wrong decision, instead of saying as individuals, well, that didn't work, maybe I should do something different the next time it comes along. What we do naturally, in the interest of self-preservation, is when the next marginal bet comes along, we just hold closer to the playbooks. And our leaders say, well, you screwed that up last time, so next time you got to bring more data to the table so we can be more sure about the idea. And the whole system gets locked up. As the burden of proof increases, more data is expected to be brought to the table, more adherence to the playbooks happens, and all of a sudden the market has moved beyond us. So the opportunity to break this cycle and to do things differently starts with individuals and the way that we think about operating within our companies. By the way, we had a great, and I should have said at the beginning, there's books out there for you. We actually do have books for all of you if you're interested in reading it. Thankfully, it's hit a bunch of the bestseller lists, and my guess is it's because we had a good cartoonist who helped us with the book and literally saved you thousands of words of reading. But this is one of them that Tom Fishburne from Marketunist contributed, where how many of you have walked out of a meeting and heard or said, I'm glad we're all aligned? So the place to start then, if you want to avoid this vicious cycle, and if you want to somehow get out of the common mindset of how things operate, is you've got to identify those orthodoxies. You've got to identify the conventional wisdom that just is kind of how we operate. So orthodoxy, there's a lot of words on this, but orthodoxy is just the stuff we do by rote. Either we've been taught it, or we've learned it on the job, or our mentors have encouraged us to follow a certain type of rule, and it's just the way that we operate day in, day out. It's how we think about strategic planning. It's how we think our competitors are going to react if we do something. It's how we think our industry operates. It's how we think we make money. It's how we think we need to go to market. It's how we think we need to spend our marketing dollars. And it's just the stuff that we grow up with. So the first challenge in breaking that vicious cycle is just to understand the orthodoxies. To look around you in any process that you follow or any moment of any day that you're in and say, why am I doing this? Is this actually fundamental to creating new economic value for the world and for my company, which, as I said, is my definition of innovation? Sometimes orthodoxies are real and necessary. So I do a lot of work in the oil and gas sector, and there's a lot of playbooks, there's a lot of rules, and some of those absolutely have to be in place because human lives are at risk. If you end up just breaking the rules and deciding to do things differently on an offshore oil rig and you blow the thing up, that's not a good idea. But a lot of the time, orthodoxies can be challenged and should be challenged, and there are no good reasons why we do things a certain way. There are no reasons why we allocate our marketing spend in certain proportions without challenging what's happening behind that. Most of the time, I find the best orthodoxies to be challenged are those that are in the commercial side of the business. There's a lot about the way companies operate that's in the kind of back office or the infrastructure of the operating footprint that actually shouldn't be challenged because it's just, there are big pieces of machinery and there are things that need to operate in a certain way in order to continue to keep the ship running, whatever metaphor you want to use. But a lot of the time, the orthodoxies that can be challenged and the opportunity to go and do something different is on the commercial side of the business and the space that all of you are in. So if I leave you with nothing else today, I hope you all feel encouraged and motivated to go and try to understand why do you do the things that you do, whether you're operating as a marketer for a company or you're in a service organization serving other companies like I am. you have the opportunity and probably the greatest likelihood of identifying the orthodoxies that are going to get most in the way. So as we were doing the research for the book, and honestly the research was mainly Steve and I getting together, talking to our clients and understanding what is the stuff that people screw up the most. We were able to identify 7 of the most common so-called deadly playbooks that exist in most scaled successful organizations. And those are the things that you see here over on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, and I want to be very clear that while these were the most common deadly playbooks that we saw, they're not deadly to everyone. And most companies need to take a look at their orthodoxies and identify their own playbooks even beyond these 7. But these are the 7 that we see showing up time and time again. The way you operate your risk management system, an example of that is the stage gate systems that I talked about before. How you ask people to bring data to the table, presuming that we're living in a linear world where most of the opportunities are below the line and known or knowable, that can really get in the way of successful growth if you're actually living in exponential times where opportunity has changed fundamentally. Strategic planning. How many of you are in organizations where you basically do your strategic planning in line with your budgeting or your financial forecasting for the year? I don't see many hands, which would suggest either you're not listening anymore or you're not telling the truth, because almost every company out there basically does strategic planning on an annual basis. When it comes time to set up our budget for the year, we think about our strategy. There is absolutely nothing that I've learned in almost 30 years of strategy consulting that would suggest that strategy is somehow dictated by the passage of the earth around the sun, at all. And increasingly, relevant strategic planning windows are decreasing. And so if we want to start improving strategic planning, one thing we can do immediately is to divorce it from the financial planning process, which, by the way, financial planning, financial forecasting is another one of the deadly playbooks. Setting our budgets every year by presuming we're going to hit a certain top-line revenue number, and then building our cost base on that to hit a margin that the street expects if we're a public company, is literally backwards. That's not the way the world operates. What you should be doing instead is understanding what behaviors do you think you can drive in the market in order to earn money. Try to imagine the business model and the asset structure you need to go and drive those behaviors, and then say, if we do things that way, how much money are we going to earn? Syndicated data is increasingly irrelevant. And if I did a show of hands again and asked you how many of you bought or served syndicated data, I bet I'd see a large number of hands. I don't trust the hand check anymore, though, so I'm just going to presume that most of you have operated in the world of syndicated data. But this is one that people often ask about, because it's somewhat correlated to the subtitle of the book about best practices. Like, syndicated data tells you the way things operate. And the interesting thing is, for a long time, best practices made sense. They were, if you're trying to improve your efficiency as a company, looking around and paying attention to what other people are doing, either in your industry or outside your industry, and copying some of those approaches made sense. But everyone has access, increasingly, especially with the rate of information flow and how we access information in the world, everyone has access to best practices and syndicated data. And therefore, by definition, best practices are not best, they're average. And so if you make your decisions based on information that's coming from a source that everyone else has access to, it might be an interesting insight into how to marginally improve your business, but you're never going to get any sort of competitive advantage from that. But it's still the way that a lot of companies decide where they're going to play and how they're going to operate. Traditional insight generation, I talked a little bit about, the notion of using focus groups and large-scale quant studies to serve below the line when you should be using ethnography and more design-oriented approaches to serve the unknown and unknowable is an example of that. Celebrating failure is actually something that when we're having discussions with clients about this and others who are interested in the book, is something that they challenge, because this is a somewhat recent phenomenon that people say, to innovate, we have to be able to fail. We have to be given room to fail. And honestly, I think that's bullshit. If you fail, you're waiting too long to make a decision. And you can argue it's a semantic here, but one of the things that we talk about, how to avoid failing, is by taking the smallest possible step forward in order to test a hypothesis and then course correct as necessary. You might say that small step forward, if you get it wrong, is failure, but more commonly, I think it's actually just thought of as learning. You're not putting massive financial or reputational risk in play when you take really small steps forward. And what's happened, unfortunately, with a lot of the companies that we serve is people assume that because leadership is saying it's okay to fail, that means they can screw things up royally and waste money royally and get away with it. And a lot of the time they do. There are companies out there, and some of you may exist in them, where they have failure awards, which I think is ridiculous. Then finally, organizational charts and career paths. Is there an award today for the greatest failure? Oh, thank God. Finally, organizational charts and career paths, the presumption that there are kind of predictable paths through an organization and certain leadership roles we can all take in a world where S&P 500 companies are no longer on the list 10 years from now is, I think you could argue, ridiculous. So it would be tremendously ironic if a couple of guys came along and challenged industry orthodoxies and playbooks by offering a different set of playbooks, and we're not doing that. But we do see 4 principles or 4 aspects of a so-called detonate mindset that we do believe are correlated with being able to blow up the playbooks and avoid ossification of processes in the future. 2 of them have to do with thinking differently, 2 of them have to do with acting differently. So on the think differently side of the equation, if we can all focus everything we do on driving the right human behavior, we'll be better off. Now, this is something that should come naturally to most people in the room with a marketing background. This has been known in marketing for a long time, that the way to drive top-line growth is to identify the behavior you want in the market for your customers to go and do, and then align your marketing resources, align the rest of your marketing, align your marketing dollars, align the rest of your resources to go and drive that behavior. If you do that, you're probably going to end up beating your competitors. But there's no reason why that just has to be true in marketing. It's true for any sort of move that we make as a company. I personally believe, and I think you could argue if you click through any sort of industry, that the most fundamental economic unit of analysis of any company anywhere is human behavior. You're not going to change your performance curve, whether you're talking about driving growth or taking out costs, unless someone somewhere changes their behavior. It may be a customer, it may be an employee, it may be a supplier, it may be a regulator, it may be a partner, but someone somewhere has to do something different in order to change performance curves. And I don't care how digital a company or how digital an economy you operate in, that's going to be true for the foreseeable future. So if we can orient the conversations we have and the questions we ask as management towards making sure that everything we're doing is driving the right human behavior that will create economic value for us, we'll be better off. And that should govern the processes that we run. Bringing a beginner's mind, this is, again, part of the subtitle of the book. It's something that is well known in the startup world. Steve Jobs talked about it a lot. Mark Benioff from Salesforce talks about it. And the basic notion is stolen, by the way, from Zen Buddhism. There's a book by Suzuki called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I always screw up the quote, but the core quote of that is something along the lines of, in the beginner's mind, there are many options. In the expert's mind, there are few. And the basic idea here, and ripping off that idea, is if you come to the table as a seasoned manager or a seasoned operator within a business, as an expert, and you bring that expertise to the table, you're naturally going to close the number of different options you have for doing something differently. And so the more we can encourage ourselves and everyone that works in these companies to bring a beginner's mind, to actually open the aperture to challenge the orthodoxies, the better off we're going to be. And then the 2 on the right, the acting differently, I've talked a little bit about before. We have to embrace impermanence and recognize that our companies, our careers, our jobs, the job we're doing today, our teams, are not going to be permanent. And instead organize ourselves to be flexible and to be adaptive to the way things are changing. We're going to be able to deal with exponential change better. And making minimally viable moves. That idea of taking a very small step, testing a hypothesis, and then either continuing on that path or course correcting if it doesn't appear to be the right way, is the best way for any company to operate any sort of exercise or any sort of activity that they're involved in. So that's the essence of the book. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's thankfully taken off a little bit in some circles at least, and people seem to like it. It's an easy read. As I said, it's got pictures. It's almost a picture book. But more than anything, I hope it's a call to do things differently and to pay attention to the stuff you just do day in, day out that doesn't add any value. So please do, if you haven't grabbed one already, we've got a table out there at least until mid-afternoon with copies for everyone here. And otherwise, I wish you best of luck today and the rest of the program. And as you head back to your companies, I hope you're able to blow some stuff up. Thank you all very much.